What I'd like to do today is give a talk about what it took to produce and deliver a Coursera MOOC on pattern-oriented concurrent and network software. And I'll be talking about a variety of different topics in this space. So the first thing I'd like to do is give you a little bit of definition of what is a MOOC. A MOOC is essentially an online course which is designed to be taken over the internet, where large numbers of people can sign up and participate or not in the course at no charge. You can take a look at the Wikipedia link to find out more about MOOCs. I personally believe, after the experiences that we had in this class, that MOOCs are going to be a very disruptive technology that are going to have a radical impact on the way in which people deliver and learn modern higher education. And you'll see that there's a lot of other people who have this perspective as well. For example, Thomas Friedman, who's the author of the famous book, The World is Flat, has an interesting article about MOOCs that appeared in the New York Times. And he characterized MOOCs as being a consequence of big breakthroughs happening when what is suddenly possible meets what is desperately necessary. In this particular case, he was referring largely to the high cost of higher education. There's a bunch of different places you can go around Vanderbilt to find out more information about MOOCs and the kinds of things that we're doing here. Here are just a smattering of your URLs you might want to take a look at. There was an article by our very own Doug Fisher last year that was talking about some of his experiences using MOOCs in a hybrid blended model in his classroom. I had an interview for so-called Software Engineering Radio shortly before my MOOC went live last spring that talks about some of the things that we're doing and some of the perspectives and directions I think this is headed. And there's also a nice website that was created by Derek Bruff based on some discussions we had at the library, again, shortly before our MOOCs took off in the spring, that were talking about what we had experienced creating the MOOCs and some of our expected results and some of the trepidations and fears we had trying to put all this different stuff together. I'd also like to give you a little bit of a timeline about how MOOCs got created at Vanderbilt to begin with. Back in February of 2012, Chancellor Zepos put together a committee that was focusing on social media and the internet. And you can take a look at this press release if you'd like to learn more about what the committee's charge was. The committee itself was chaired by Jay Clayton and John Sloop, and members from EECS, Doug Fisher and myself were also involved as part of this committee. About 7 months later, the Chancellor announced that the Vanderbilt University was going to be joining a number of other members of the Coursera consortium, and that we would start to create and deliver a number of different MOOCs using that particular platform. That project, which had been kind of going on in stealth mode for about a month or so before the announcement, was led by Cynthia Cyrus, and there were a number of other people that she quickly appointed to be part of an online education task force here at Vanderbilt that included myself, Derek Bruff, John Sloop, and others. The initial focus of what we've been doing with Coursera was not intended for credit for Vanderbilt courses. None of the things that we're doing here in our Coursera experience provides anybody any credit from a Vanderbilt point of view. The most that they get out of it is something that's called a statement of accomplishment. There's a couple different flavors of that we'll talk about later. There's an interesting article that appeared in Information Week recently that talks about some of the reasons why Vanderbilt went this particular course. We're viewing, at the moment, MOOCs primarily from the point of view as outreach, not as ways to make money by delivering our actual courses for credit online. On October 2nd, 2013, we had a visit from Stanford professor and co-founder of Coursera, Daphne Koller, and she gave a very interesting lecture over in the law school talking about her motivations for being involved in massive open online courses. I encourage you to take a look at the video. She had some very interesting things to say that kind of motivate the social need that's driving the effort. In March 2013, March 4th and 5th to be specific, our first round of MOOC courses were launched. I taught the very first one. David Owens from Owen Business School started teaching his the second day after mine went live. And you can take a look at the Coursera website under the Vanderbilt link to find out more information about the offerings that we have here. Since that point, Jamie Pope's course has also gone live, Jay Clayton's course has gone live, and there's about to be another course taught by Paul Harris and some of his colleagues at the medical school. In May 2013, Doug Fisher was appointed to be the founding director for the Vanderbilt Institute for Digital Learning. And this is going to be responsible for a variety of things, MOOCs included, but also broader themes related to digital learning. And Doug is doing a whole bunch of different things at the moment, not the least of which is preparing for the second round of MOOCs we're going to be doing here at Vanderbilt. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. And then next week, next Monday, we're actually going to have our committee meeting on the Chancellor's Committee on New Education Technologies. This is one of the Chancellor's 4 main vision or thrust areas for Vanderbilt going into the future. And this particular committee will involve a number of other folks, myself, Dan Fleetwood, various people who've taught MOOCs here from Coursera perspective and otherwise will be involved with trying to figure out what the agenda is moving forward. So one of the things I'd like to underscore here is that EECS faculty have been involved in Coursera and MOOCs and digital learning right from the start here over the last year or so. My particular offering in this space was the pattern-oriented software architecture course. And the first offering focused on concurrent and network software. You can take a look. All the material is still online, even though the class ended in May. You can still register. You can take a look. You can go and view the videos. You can take a look at the various assignments we gave out. You can look at the slides. You can follow along with the discussion group forums and see what people asked and the kinds of responses you got and that we gave them and so on. So it's a nice place to go look archivally for what we did. I'll give you a little overview of what the course was based on. For those of you here who've taken some of my other courses, the POSA MOOC was an amalgamation of several classes here at Vanderbilt that I've been teaching for a while. One of which is the CS 251 class, which is a class on intermediate software design. The focus of that class is predominantly on software patterns and frameworks using C++. We also had some material based on the CS 282 course, which is a course on systems programming in Android. And there was another course, which was a graduate course that I've taught many years ago, hasn't been taught in a while, called CS 395, and that focused on advanced network programming. So there were bits and pieces from all those different classes pulled together. We actually took the course videos that we filmed for Coursera and used them in CS 251 last spring in a way to supplement the lecture material. So students could watch those videos if they wanted to learn things above and beyond what we covered in lecture. If I talked too fast in lecture, they could go back and watch the material. If they had to miss lecture or they zoned out in lecture, they could all go back and watch some of the material there as well. So it was a good example of how the digital learning material we're creating here at Vanderbilt is being fed back to other purposes. Here's a couple of interesting factoids about the POSA course. When all was said and done, there were about 1,200 slides created. And even though I taught some of this material for decades, many of the slides were new. And there were 2 reasons for that. Number one, as we'll talk about later, when you teach a course online, you really can't anticipate what students' questions are going to be. You can't anticipate what their background is going to be. So we had to produce a lot of material we ordinarily wouldn't have had in a regular course because we would have had a lot more chance to interact with people live. Likewise, there's a lot of issues related to the use of, or not allowed to be able to use, copyrighted images. And so one of the things we did was do a careful scrubbing through all the material and remove all the copyrighted images and replace them with ones that were available with a Creative Commons license. Or in a couple of cases, we used things that had appeared in books I'd written where I got explicit permission from the publisher. So that was a little different from a normal course material. We ended up with about 20 hours of video and about 85 videos, so it was quite a production ordeal. And as I'll talk about later, it took a long time to create all this material. In fact, it took about 3 months of production where we would film a couple hours a day, almost every day, and then I would spend lots of time preparing the slides, practicing the slides in my head, all for a course that ran roughly about 8 weeks or so as far as the number of lectures went. I was very fortunate not to have to do all this myself the first time. We had a great production team, many of whom have transitioned over to the Vanderbilt Institute for Digital Learning, VITAL, and they're going to be doing a great job of creating new courses over time as well. And I also had a lot of help from people like Zach McCormick, who was the TA for the course, and John Brazel, who was another person who helped out. So Mike Martin and John Sloop and some other people were instrumental. When the course first started, there were 31,000 people enrolled. Over time, and we'll talk about this later, the actual number of people who finished the course at the end and got the statement of accomplishment was much lower than the number of people who enrolled, and that's a pretty common trend in MOOCs. But it certainly gave us an interesting perspective on the scale at which we can reach people around the world. it would have taken me about 600 years to teach that many people here at Vanderbilt. I teach roughly 50 or so students a year, maybe a little bit more now because our enrollments have gone up. But it would have taken a very long time to teach that many people face-to-face. You can also see from this heat map that we had people literally from all around the world. In fact, I think every single person in Luxembourg was enrolled in the class, as far as I could tell, if you look at the heat map. I'll give you a URL to a paper later that talks a bit more about some of the breakdown of the demographics, where people were from, which people stuck with the class. Interestingly enough, a large number of people were from Eastern Europe, and they tended to stick through the class. People from other parts of the world maybe dropped off more rapidly, so we're still doing some research and analysis to figure out what made people stay and what made them drop out. Let me tell you some lessons we learned from creating the MOOC in the first place. So one of the things I discovered, unlike my normal classes here, many of which you people have taken in the audience, we typically go for 70 to 75 minutes of straight lecture. For various reasons, you never record that much material in a MOOC video. The recommended length of time is something around 10 minutes. I stretch that out to about 15 to 20 in some cases, because you really have a hard time saying much interesting in a technical sense in only 10 minutes. But the point was I had a lot of material to cover, and I certainly wasn't going to do it by having one very, very long lecture. So I broke the course up into a number of sections. And each section was composed of modules. Each module was composed of parts, and each part was around 15 to 20 minutes long. So a section was kind of like a book in a multi-series book series. Each module was kind of like maybe a chapter in the book, and each part was sort of like a section or subsection in the book. Every 5 minutes or so, a video quiz would pop up in the middle of the video, and it would ask the students questions about what they'd just been listening to. These quizzes were important to make sure people were following along. They weren't zoning out. If you've ever done any kind of online training or other kinds of certification online, you're probably familiar with this particular approach. I'm not going to talk in detail about the actual contents of the course, although that was quite interesting due to lack of time. But essentially, it talked a lot about what does it mean to develop concurrent and network software, what are some of the key patterns that we have to think about when we do this, what are some of the framework approaches we do for this, and how might you realize those patterns in languages that are object-oriented, like C++ or Java. And then there was a long section that talked at length about topics related to case studies of concurrent and network software. And I also had thrown in another section that related to Gang of Four patterns. The Gang of Four is kind of the classic patterns that were published about 20 years ago that are fundamental to object-oriented design. And even though those particular patterns are not necessarily all that relevant to concurrent network programming, it's very useful to have that perspective if you're a software developer. So I filmed an appendix that had that material in it. We also had to spend some time addressing one of the interesting quirks of the Coursera platform at this point. There are no prerequisites, so you have absolutely no idea what people's background is going to be when they take your courses. Some people could be experts with 20 years of experience. Other people might be beginners who don't even know how to log into a computer. And so for that reason, unlike a Vanderbilt course where you have a pretty good idea of the type of experience and background and knowledge students have when they come into your class, usually, and they usually have the background, the Coursera environment was nothing like that. So we had to spend a lot of time filming introductory material I normally wouldn't have covered in a course that I've been teaching here. Something else that I spent a lot of time on, in retrospect, this was probably overkill, but it was a lot of fun. I'm a very visual person, and I knew that a lot of people I was going to be talking to might not be hardcore technical people with a lot of programming background, or people who necessarily knew all the programming languages or all the systems, middleware, tools, operating environments, and so on. So I tried as hard as I could to pick interesting visual metaphors to make the material more compelling to people. So I picked examples like these pictures. These were intended when I talked about patterns. These were examples of real-world patterns, traffic circles, clover leaves, and so on. When I talked about replication and the need to have redundancy in replicas, I found a nice picture of something that connoted that. Likewise, when I was talking about network congestion, I found a good picture of India traffic jam, where you could just tell at a glance there was a lot of congestion and things weren't getting through in a timely way. And maybe my very favorite metaphor of all was something I used repeatedly when I wanted to talk about multi-core processing. It turned out I couldn't find a non-copyrighted image of a multi-core chip, Moreover, what does a multi-core chip look like that's really interesting in the first place? So instead I found some pictures of Apple cores that were not copyrighted, and I replicated them. So that was my multi-core metaphor to use when people needed to see that. Like I said, this may have been overkill, but it was a lot of fun, and it certainly made my slides more interesting to look at. Another thing we spent some time on, although in retrospect not enough time, was on trying to come up with meaningful ways to assess students' progress in the course. When you take a course here at Vanderbilt, at least the course that I teach, and I'm sure the same is true for many other courses, you get a lot of personalized feedback. For the courses I teach, I try to give every student personalized comments on every line of code that they write, and that's great because they get a lot of, hopefully they get a lot of insight about what they can do better. There's obviously no way you're going to give that kind of feedback to 10, 20, 30,000 people. You just completely go insane. So we did two things to try to deal with that. One was we tried to have automated quizzes for some things. These are basically multiple choice style questions, either ones that popped up in the videos which didn't count towards the grade, or things that counted towards the grade and they had to take on a weekly basis. And those were just, again, just to kind of make sure people were following along. And then we also applied something called peer graded assessment. And this was much more interesting, much more scalable, but also ultimately less satisfying because you were relying on students to grade each other's work. And even though many of them had good intentions, they were all over the place in terms of their background, their consistency of applying the rubrics, their interest in trying to do this consistently, fairly, etc. So that's still kind of a work in progress for a lot of the things that are taking place in the MOOC community, how to assess people at scale. Quite frankly, we spent way too much time on the videos, and by the time we got around to the assessments right before the course launched, we realized that we were going to have to sort of make it up as we went along. And I'm very grateful to Zach McCormick because he did a yeoman's job figuring out how to do the assessments, doing the rubrics, getting the peer graded assessment mechanisms to work. And it worked okay, but I think we can definitely do better the next time we go around and do this for the second time. There's also an enormously different set of experiences trying to create a course that's going to be a MOOC. One of the most obvious things is, unlike giving a normal course where you can look at people and they look at you and they give you feedback and you can see when they're bored or you can see when they're basically not understanding what's going on, you get none of that feedback whatsoever. In fact, you spend your entire time standing in front of a green screen, that looks kind of like this, and talking into a camera that looks kind of like this. And that's how you have to figure out how to generate your enthusiasm. You have to look into this camera lens pretty much like a teleprompter and get as excited and energetic as you can so the students will follow along and have an enjoyable experience. And believe me, that's a lot of work to do that. One of the things I prided myself on, but in retrospect I'm not so sure it was such a good idea, I worked very hard to have seamless transitions between slides. My gold standard at the time was just to start talking and then clicking buttons, kind of like a one-man band, and video clips would show up or slides would appear and text would show up, and I'd just keep talking. And the idea was just to sort of have this discussion. That was kind of cool from the point of view of making it look like you're standing in front of somebody and talking to them. The problem was that when we try to go back and make updates to the videos, there's no easy place to do a cut. So a better perspective probably is to pause at the end of each slide or the end of each little section of slides so that if you have to go back later, which you inevitably will have to do, and update material or make fixes, it's going to be easier to splice the stuff in. And that was something that just didn't occur to me when we did the course the first time. But now that we're looking at doing it again, it would be nice to be able to go back and cut and paste much more readily. Something else I spent a lot of time on, and I'm actually quite glad I invested the time in this, was in post-production. So filming the videos and making the slides is just the start. After that point, you have to go back and watch the videos over and over again as it's being produced, make sure that the transitions work clearly and correctly, that the animations are occurring at the right time, make sure that there are no glitches in the audio or the video or the synchronization between the video and the slides. And believe me, there's all kinds of crazy things that can occur. I must have watched those videos maybe 5 times each, and there were 85 of them. So I became very good at listening to myself talking back at 2.5x, which was about the speed I could go before I couldn't understand what I was saying, because I could get through the videos much faster that way. One of the things that's come from doing this is I've learned enough about video production that I'm now recording all of my classes, and I have a YouTube channel, and all the videos I make in my courses go up on the YouTube channel as soon as I render them the next day. And there's actually a community of people who are sort of following along outside of the Vanderbilt community. The Vanderbilt students, of course, can go back and watch them as well, but there are other people following along. And we're using this as a way to get perspectives and insights and analysis and feedback for future versions of the MOOC. And something else I learned, because I went and watched myself at first after the first couple days of filming, and I was spending so much time concentrating on trying to do all these different things that I looked constipated. In fact, I kind of looked like this. If anybody knows what that is, that's the famous 1984 ad. And so I really had to teach myself to be more relaxed and to smile occasionally. Even if what I was saying didn't really sound funny, I would just sort of smile, and it just made me look more normal. And that's probably not a bad thing to do. I think the students really don't want you to gaze intensely at them like a Gorgon stare, not being able to blink. That's a little bit disconcerting after a while. Well, those were some of the lessons that we learned creating the MOOC, and it was a lot of work, but I think it was fundamentally worth it because we had a very interesting time doing this, learning lessons that we could replicate for other projects that we're doing here at Vanderbilt, and I'll talk more about that later. When we were done with the 3-month preparation, I know Zach and I and Jesse Badash, who also helped us out, we were all extremely happy. We thought, wow, we're done with the hard part. We can just play the videos back, and the course will just sort of teach itself. Well, we were in for a huge surprise. There was actually way more work required after the course went live than there was producing the course, and I'll talk about some of the reasons for that. So first, a few things about the Coursera platform. So I won't consider myself an expert Coursera user. Zach is probably an expert Coursera user. I'm a pretty good user of Coursera, and it's fairly straightforward to learn. It's nicely scalable. You can distribute videos to literally millions of people around the world with pretty good reliability, with pretty good latency, and all the other quality of service characteristics that you'd come to expect from a modern platform for learning management. But it's a bit tedious to use. This, of course, is a work in progress. By the time we started using Coursera, it really wasn't even a year old at that point. Now it's gotten better. But here were some of the things that we wrestled with a lot, and I think are still kind of a work in progress. One of the things that was tough for the students was it was hard for them to get a bird's eye view of their progress at any given point in the course. There was no single dashboard where they could find out what their scores were on all the various assignments or what assignments were going to be due next. We made a little calendar that helped out with that a bit, but it was difficult for them to figure out where they stood, and a lot of people didn't like that. So we ended up creating a grading calculator that they could use that would help them know where they were in terms of progress in the course. The other thing was people had a million suggestions on how to improve the course, and a lot of the things had to do with the platform, and we had very little control over the platform. So we would push people towards the Coursera platform portal for reporting requests for service or bug reports or suggestions and so on. So I'm sure they got a lot of suggestions on how to improve things as a result of our course. Something else that surprised me, that some of the platforms that we come to use all the time now, like Android or iPhone or even certain browsers, really weren't very well supported by Coursera. Internet Explorer, certain versions seemed to work pretty well. Chrome seemed to work pretty well. A lot of other stuff, it was always sort of a crapshoot as to whether it would work or not. And that was sort of a surprise. It was also difficult to do certain things in the course as we went through the course. So one of the things we did, and I'll talk about this later, we ended up crowdsourcing all the programming assignments so that people could program in basically 6 different programming languages: Java, C++, Ruby, Scala, Python, and there was one more, but it was a bunch of different languages that people, C#, that was the other one. And so we had different versions of every single programming assignment. And that quickly got unwieldy because there's no easy way in the Coursera platform to hierarchically group these things so that you could see just the C# stuff or just the C++ stuff, but not everything. And as the course went on, we had 4 or 5 assignments, each of which had 6 different or more variations. So that got a little bit unwieldy after a while. And there was something else that was a little challenging at the time. This has since been fixed, but there was no way for the course instructor to go in and edit the transcripts of the audio. So one of the great things that Coursera does is they have audio transcripts from what you say, so people who are maybe not native English speakers or people who, for whatever reason, can't follow the rate at which you're talking or whatnot, can go back and read the subtitles. But unfortunately, whoever did the transcription didn't always make the right choice of phrases for things we would talk about. So pattern would turn into patent or something like that. And there was no way to edit that. So those things would just stay in the subtitles, and people who were not native English speakers, I'm sure, were somewhat hopelessly confused at times because they couldn't understand what the words meant. One of the things that I found most interesting about the course was the high degree of interaction with students. Students were extremely engaged, and our course was actually one of the lower courses in terms of number of people actually posting things in the discussion forum. If you take a look at the number of people posting in Jamie Pope's nutrition course or David Owen's course on strategic innovation, they had probably, gosh, 50,000 posts or more. We had somewhere around 8,000, which was quite a lot, believe me. But one of the things that that showed was that people who were taking these classes were really eager to communicate, to interact. And I found in many cases that the students who were my online students were actually much more interactive than the students I have in my classes. When I have a class at Vanderbilt, a lot of really, really smart people, but very few people ask questions, very few people raise their hands. I couldn't get these people online to stop. They just kept going and going. It was fantastic. There were a couple different reasons for that. One reason was the demographic. Here is a little histogram or bar chart showing the age variation in the course. And as you can see, the bulk of the people were 25 to 29, and then it just goes off after that. There were lots of people who were in their mid-30s, there were people who were in their 40s, there were people in there who were in their 50s, so it was a real range of ages. In fact, there's almost nobody in there who is what you would consider the classic Vanderbilt freshman or sophomore, people who are 18 or 19 years old. So this was not the typical demographic that you would find here, and I found that quite interesting. Another thing that we also attributed this to is the fact that when you post something in the online discussion forums, you're relatively anonymous. In fact, you can choose to be anonymous if you decide to, but even if you're not anonymous, people don't really know who you are, and I'm not sitting really in judgment on the people. I'm not going to lower them because they asked a dumb question. I'm not going to lower their grade. Not that I would do that here either, but basically people didn't feel inhibited. And there's actually something called the Ring of Gyges, which is an interesting Platonic exercise in asking whether or not people will be moral if they're invisible. And this is one of the things I think that accounts for a lot of discussions that takes place in online forum, like discussion groups on news sites or in Coursera and elsewhere. It was kind of fun. There were a regular group of people who participated very heavily, often people who had a lot of experience in the field. There's a way in Coursera to keep track of so-called reputation points, which is a combination of different things, whether people like what you have to say and they upvote you or they downvote you, the number of comments you make, the number of threads you start or participate in, and so on. And so there were certain people who really went above and beyond the call in engaging. And we're hoping to be able to get those people involved in the next version as so-called community TAs, which would be great because then we wouldn't have to answer all the questions. The other thing that made the course really fun was we did something that at the time was not really widely done. We were actually some of the innovators here. We did something called virtual office hours. So one of the big complaints about a MOOC is the fact that people miss the human contact, the ability to actually interact with the instructor or the TAs and so on. So we tried to remedy that by having office hours, which used a combination of Google Hangout and YouTube channel. And so if you go to YouTube, you can see the results of these things. I would basically start a Google Hangout session and connect it up with YouTube, and then I would talk about things and I would display on my laptop screen, and students could literally in real time ask me questions through YouTube chat, and then I would go ahead and answer their questions in real time. So that was really exciting. It gave me a chance to get to know people better than I ever possibly could have. I got to find out the kinds of issues that people had that were recurring. And it also was a great way because all the lectures had been recorded a month or so before the course started. It allowed me to go back and change what I was saying or clarify what I was saying in ways that would have been very difficult if I had had to go back and try to re-record all the high-quality videos. And this was also kind of what inspired me to take this a little deeper and start recording my regular classes as well. Something else that's important, you're going to get people asking you a lot of questions from a lot of different points of view, and they're cultural issues. Some cultures are very demanding, some cultures are very polite. It seems that people who engage on Coursera tend to be very demanding, and you just have to learn to be patient. Many of you probably don't remember who Gomer Pyle was, but it was a TV show that was played in the 60s and 70s. It's probably still available through syndication rerun. And there was a person on Gomer Pyle called Sergeant Carter. He was always upset about something, and he'd always yell and shout. And at one point, Gomer and his buddies had a bet with Sergeant Carter that he couldn't go 24 hours without blowing his top, which was extremely hard for him. And so if you watch this particular video and look at the time sequence there, you'll see that Sergeant Carter finally just can't take it anymore, so he drives away from base, goes up to a hill and just starts yelling at the top of his lungs. And there were times in this course when I felt like doing that because it was just so incredibly frustrating and people would ask the craziest questions and you just have to go back to first principles. But being patient really paid off. Another thing I thought that was quite interesting, students, and this is something we see at Vanderbilt but not quite in the same way in a lot of the computer science and software engineering courses we teach, students tend to teach from their own, they tend to speak or express themselves from their own position and their own experience, and sometimes don't realize that there's other ways of doing and being. So for example, we had a lot of students there who were building end-user applications, probably in JavaScript. And they would argue vehemently that there was absolutely no need whatsoever to worry about reuse or frameworks or patterns or anything because that's not the world they lived in. And they just couldn't possibly imagine anybody could do anything but what they did. Likewise, there were a lot of people who worked for companies where software was kind of an afterthought. This is unfortunately very common these days in a lot of domains. And so software design expertise was not valued. Software programming expertise was valued, but people didn't really want to get too deep into it. And so they felt like nobody cared about this stuff. And so discussing things like patterns and frameworks and middleware and all this stuff, they just couldn't for the life of themselves understand why that was relevant. Honestly, I wasn't quite sure why they were taking the course at some level, but we had lots and lots and lots of discussions about this, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. I think in large measure it's the job of the instructor and the TAs to help broaden people's horizons. That's one of the things I found very rewarding, was discussing with people who had these perceptions and trying to walk them to a point where they could understand the bigger picture. If you didn't have that engagement with the discussion groups, you'd have a much harder time getting them to realize that. So that's a good transition into the discussion about the online discussion forums, which is really the thing that, to my surprise, was the bulk of the time I spent in the course. So when we first started this stuff out, I thought, you know, people will just post mundane little things, little tidbits, like I had this experience, or I'm from so-and-so part of the world, anybody around here want to meet up with me to discuss this course? Well, right from the very first minute the course went live, there were questions popping up all around the world. What's the grading policy? What are the videos that are going to be released next week? Tell us about this, that, and the other thing. And one of the things I found was interesting was me and Zach really engaged very deeply in this, and that helped to transition the class from being lecture-oriented, which is what it would have otherwise been, to being learning-oriented. We were really committed to making sure people actually understood stuff, not just did they watch the videos or not. One of the other things I noticed was that very few students seemed to go back and read the discussion board before posting their questions. So we eventually got smart and just created a little file of frequently asked questions, and when people would ask them again, we just give out the links to our responses, so we wouldn't have to keep answering the same thing over and over and over again. Strong or heavy instructor engagement and TA engagement was also important in the forums for a couple other reasons. One thing was there were lots of misconceptions about software. I'll talk a bit more about them later, but a lot of misconceptions, and so having us there to address those misconceptions quickly helped the issues from sort of going from a little bit of a light smolder to a raging fire. And if you take a look at some MOOCs where the instructors and TAs are not very much engaged, you see the flame wars begin almost immediately. When Jamie Pope taught her nutrition course, one of the first things she observed after watching the discussion forum was that nutrition is not it's not about a science, it's a belief system. And there are people out there who really believe very strongly in different positions about genetically modified food or different kinds of diets or gluten-free versus something else. And she was amazed at how passionate people were about these various topics. So having the instructor involvement can really help to keep those things from flaming out of control. We also really spent a lot of time trying to build up goodwill. We wanted the students to realize that we cared about what they thought, we were there to help them learn, and that turned to be very useful. People contributed a lot of stuff back to the course, I'll talk more about that later, via crowdsourcing. And we managed, for the most part, I'd say 98% of the time, 99% of the time, the discussions and disagreements we had were quite constructive. People really never lost their temper. There were no posts we had to delete. That was one of the things I was very proud of. As an instructor, you have the ability to delete things you don't like, if you so choose. But in some sense, when you get to that point, you really haven't been kind of keeping an eye on stuff. If you want to see an example of some of this stuff, there's a link you might want to go to where someone was complaining about some things in the videos. They said that these videos are too introductory. And the first ones were actually too introductory in many ways. But a lot of people wrote back instantly and said, hey, that's exactly what we need to have. We need to have the stuff that's background because we don't have that background. And I think if we had just ignored them, they wouldn't have stood up for us and helped to dispel the myth or dispel the perception. Students, because they were so engaged, triggered lots of improvements to the course. One of the things we quickly learned was that people wanted to watch the videos over the weekend, like Weekend at Bernie's, right? And so what they wanted to be able to do was be able to watch these things in their free time. So we started releasing the material on Friday, not on Monday as we originally had planned to do, so that way they could catch up over the weekend. We also had a lot of people who said, this is not my full-time job being a Coursera student. Although ironically, there were many students who were taking like 5 courses at once, which seemed quite amazing. And so we originally had a late days policy where people could have some late days they could apply if they missed the occasional quiz. And then later, because all the quizzes were auto-graded, we just said, hey, if you finish this quiz by the time the course is done, we'll count it. So we had all the quizzes with a deadline at the end of the course. And as long as people got them done by then, no harm done. We also had a lot of help from people crowdsourcing various things. I had a lot of embedded URLs in my slides, and people said, wouldn't it be great if you could extract those URLs and put them up on the course wiki? And I said, yeah, it'd be great. Why doesn't somebody take it on as a mission? So a bunch of people crowdsourced that, and they created a wiki with every slide deck I had. They pulled out all the URLs and put them up on the website, so you could just go through there and click them at your leisure. We also had people take the programming assignments, which we wrote in C++. The programming assignments were described in C++, and they ported the assignment to Java, C#, Python, Ruby, and Scala. And so that allowed a lot more people to be involved who otherwise wouldn't have taken the course because they didn't want to program in C++. And we also ended up having people do things with ACE or Boost or Qt or Netty. There were a bunch of different frameworks and platforms people used as they were doing this. And that allowed us to be able to leverage the power of the crowd to do things we weren't going to do. And of course, they also, if you ever want people to find every imaginable glitch in anything you produce, put it in a MOOC environment. Every single typo, every broken link, every time I said in the video too many times, people would say, yeah, you got to go back and fix that. So it was a great way to get the quality tremendously improved in everything we're doing. As I mentioned before, people were generally very civil in the discussions, very technically focused. And in fact, many of them were very, very knowledgeable. I'll talk more about that later. So kind of in a nutshell, listening to the students, being flexible, taking into account what they were trying to do, realizing they didn't have the same constraints, the same needs, the same opportunities that Vanderbilt students do. Many of them worked full-time and so on. And trying to really be responsive to their needs helped to make them much more interested in learning what we had to speak. But as David Owens often says, there's infinite need out there, so you have to be a little careful. You could spend your whole life doing nothing but answering questions on the discussion forum. So it's important to triage the responses and leave the ones that really could be addressed by other people to let them address them. Here's some other things we learned. So this was a design course. This was a course on software design patterns. It was not an algorithms course. It was not really a programming course in the classic sense, although there was programming involved. And so as a result, assessing student quality was rather tricky. It wasn't just like, here, write up this piece of code, and then we'll see if it compiles and runs and gives back the right answer. It was really about the more ineffable quality without a name. It was about design quality. And that's much, much harder to try to teach and assess than a regular course. For my money, when I think about what the value proposition is for face-to-face courses here at Vanderbilt, I think what we really need to be spending our time on are the things that are not easily reduced to auto-grading. If Vanderbilt instruction turns into auto-grading, we've lost it, right? We need to be focusing on the things where you need the personal touch, the mentorship, and so on. Another interesting observation, students didn't like to do things that weren't programming. They wanted to program. They didn't want to have to do essays. They didn't want to have to do stuff that was about design. They wanted to talk about how to write code and look at code, which I could respect. That makes sense. That's another thing I think that differentiates the MOOC audience, who are very focused on particular specific skills, from the kind of experiences we get out of our Vanderbilt students. People here are great programmers, they're great designers, but they also want to know the big picture. They want to know what's the economic implication, what's the social implication, how's this going to make me a better entrepreneur, how can I get leadership from this. Speaking and writing are also valued as skills. So different kind of educational model. I was somewhat dismayed to see that despite the fact that this was not a real course and nobody got a real grade in the normal sense of the word, there was actually a non-trivial amount of plagiarism. And when people would do the peer grading, they'd say, hey, so-and-so, I saw the same solution cut and pasted multiple times, and I found it on the web. And that kind of bothered me, because this is not a competitive environment. You're not taking this course because you want to get into Harvard or something. You're taking this course because you want to learn. So I was somewhat surprised by that. But I was also interested to learn, and this is perhaps my ethnocentricity showing through. When I first started doing this course, I thought, this isn't a real course. This is a faux course. We teach real courses here at Vanderbilt. So I was very surprised how obsessed people were by the grading policies and why they wanted to be able to know what did it take to get a statement of accomplishment. And part of the answer there was that in many parts of the world, they don't have the kind of education environment we do. They don't have the same kind of opportunities for employment that we do. And in that world, having a certificate of accomplishment or a statement of accomplishment from a Coursera course helps get you further in front of the line when you're going to interview for your job at the call center or whatever you might be doing. So they were getting something that actually meant real economic value to them. A statement of accomplishment from a Coursera course meant something in their world. And I hadn't thought about that until about 30 minutes into the class when it went live, how many people really cared about this. So as I said, lots of interest in grading policy. Lots of people who wanted the course customized for their own needs. Again, you could spend your whole life trying to personalize the learning. I think that the lesson to draw from this is there's many things we can be doing here at Vanderbilt in digital learning to make ourselves more effective for the students that we teach. And I'll talk more about that towards the end. Here's a few differences between the kind of courses we teach in a face-to-face manner here at Vanderbilt and the kinds of things that we do in MOOCs. Tremendous amount of confusion over what is the scope of the course. When I teach 251, people pretty much know the course is for those who've taken 201 and done well. They know data structures, they know Java, they know some C++, they know object-oriented programming a little bit, and that's where we start. We had no idea who the people were for this course. So as a result, because we did a lot of this introductory material for the first couple of weeks, the experienced programmers were bored, and the beginners thought we should have done stuff that was even more introductory. So there's really no easy way to be able to satisfy them all with a single course. I think the solution to this is something that I'll talk about at the very end, which we call sequenced MOOCs, which is creating a curriculum of courses that build on each other from simple to more complex, much like we do here in Vanderbilt for a real curriculum. And I think that's where the world's going to head over time. It was also fascinating the degree of experience that we had in the people who were taking the class. If I teach a course here at Vanderbilt, I've got students who have SAT scores asymptotically approaching perfection at this point. I mean, it's staggering, the SAT scores. We just saw the other day, I think the average SAT score for the entering class is something like 1,500 in the engineering school, which is fantastic. But there's pretty much nobody, unless they're a Mozart-level child prodigy who has 15 to 20 years of experience developing software at that level. So there's a kind of discussion you can have with a person who's got that kind of experience that you can't have with a person, even if they're incredibly smart, because they just don't have that background, that depth of knowledge. However, having said that, it also meant that even though the discussions were more interesting, people were typically a lot more skeptical to get into learning mode. So when I teach a course here, I show up to class and I say, we're going to talk about patterns, and people go, patterns? And they keep track, and we have a good time, we do assignments. Very few people say to me things like, patterns are a really bad idea. People would say stuff in the MOOC like, patterns are bad, or patterns are only for languages that are C++ or Java. They're not for all languages. Or patterns are only there to make up for deficiencies in certain languages. And we would have long discussions on the forum about this. And eventually, I was very happy that people eventually sort of listened and they learned. But you don't meet that kind of resistance with typical students because they don't have the paradigm and experience and biases and misconceptions and so on that they bring to the table. So that was also something that was a little bit surprising. And you would be amazed at the number of people who think object-oriented programming is bad, or C++ is bad, or Java is bad, or middleware is bad. Pretty much anything you can imagine, somebody thinks it's bad. And people feel very, very strongly and passionately about their favorite technology, which I can certainly understand. I have my own beliefs as well, but it was just a little bit surprising. Another thing that's a little bit awkward is that the videos that you produce, by their very nature, or at least their very nature in the Coursera platform, are static. You're not going to replace them moment by moment, typically, unless you have video production processed down to a fine art. And they're linear. You have to start at the beginning and watch them through to the end. Now, they may be short, so you could mix and match, but the Coursera platform doesn't really lend itself to wandering around through a space of videos in some kind of network-like way. So this tends to create a lot of confusion, because there could be topics that come up in the video that are going to be addressed in the next video, but people don't know it's there, they don't know what's coming, they can't raise their hand. So in a normal course, people would get those answers right away. They would raise their hand, or they'd come to office hours, or they'd send me an email. We'd deal with it on the spot. In this environment, things were a lot more asynchronous. They had to take place in the discussion forums, they had to take place in the virtual office hours, and people wouldn't always listen to the answers, so it was somewhat confusing. So there was this whole issue of consistency of uptake. People didn't understand what was being said, or they just didn't pay attention, or they would forget. So that was a big source of confusion. It was also obviously a lot harder for students to understand the material we didn't cover in detail in the videos. And even though we had 20 hours of videos, that's just scratching the surface of the topics related to concurrent and network software. So invariably, there would be things people just didn't have enough background in. Whereas in Vanderbilt, they come to office hours, they raise their hand, there's things they can do to get their itch scratched almost instantaneously. I think that one way we could do a better job with this is to do more sophisticated course management platforms with better hyperlinking. You could have slides that show videos to illustrate the points better, have animations, and so on. I've actually, since I did the Coursera video, I've actually done some other training that's been recorded in a more professional way. And they can actually put that kind of stuff in there, but it takes a lot of production time to do that right. The attrition rate is also very high. This is, at first glance, it seems like it's a dark secret of MOOCs, but it's really quite interesting. You'll end up typically with the typical completion rate, where completion means got through all the wickets and got a statement of accomplishment, is somewhere around 5% in most MOOCs. We were very proud of the fact that the MOOCs we did at Vanderbilt were more 10 to 15% completion, which was pretty cool. Now, the interesting part is, even though you have this gigantic attrition rate, by the time you're all done, you're still teaching more students than you would teach in decades, right? So even with the attrition rate, I had 1,600 people getting statements of accomplishment, and more like 20,000 actually watched the videos and did other things. So that's still way more than I ever meet here, but when you look at the original number, it doesn't seem quite so impressive. Derek Bruff has actually, from the Center for Teaching, has actually gone through all the course statistics from the Coursera platform and written a nice blog posting that you might want to look at that analyzes them for the different MOOCs that have gone live so far. There's a bunch of open issues with MOOCs. I'm a fan. I'll talk more about that at the very end, but I want to be realistic here. And so we have to think carefully about this genre and how we want to be engaged with it as faculty. One thing that is absolutely not clear at all is what's the financial model, what's the credentialing model. I'm pretty confident in saying that my MOOC was education, but it was not college education. I taught college material, but I didn't assess people as I would assess college students. And so I think that's something we have to be concerned with. There's various attempts at trying to monetize MOOCs. There's digital learning, online content. Some people have been doing this for a long time and are confused as to why this is even novel at all. But I think it's novel at the scale at which it's being done. Georgia Tech has an interesting master's degree project they're about to unroll that uses online learning in conjunction with Udacity and AT&T. There's also a huge threat, I think this is where most people's concern comes from in the education profession, of de-skilling or disintermediating educators in education. And I think this is particularly going to be a problem at institutions like community colleges or some state universities that are very strapped for cash and have a lot of people they have to educate. They can't really raise the tuition beyond a certain amount. The legislature's not giving them large amounts of money like they used to. In fact, they're getting cuts. And they don't have big endowments or donor bases to fall back on to make up the slack. There's also some people who just think this whole thing is a bad idea. There's an interesting article by a guy named Jonathan Rees. A lot of people who bash MOOCs don't really understand that they've only been around for a year or so, and they don't see where it's evolving to. They just see what the first couple of dozen or 100 courses were like. Things are going to change very rapidly. We talk about things changing in MOOC years. A MOOC year is like, a week is like a MOOC year. It's a year in real life. And obviously, it goes without saying, especially at a place like Vanderbilt with great immersive education, there's a lot more to going to college than just passing the material you're you're tested on in the class. There's a lot more about learning to be an adult, learning to think critically, working with other people, getting leadership skills, all kinds of other things. So from my point of view, a place like Vanderbilt is going to be successful to the extent that we can figure out how to take MOOCs and other digital learning material, tools, paradigms, and so on, and help to make what we do best, which is face-to-face immersion education, even more effective. And I'm going to talk more about that in just a second. I also think it's important for us to figure out how to use this approach to differentiate ourselves from our competitors. There's lots of other people who are trying to offer the same kinds of things that we are. Great universities. We're number 17 in the US News and World Report, and we've been that way for a while. That's fantastic. But there's other people who are ahead of us. There's other people who would like to overtake us. When you start getting up into the top 20 and you look at the names of those universities, you realize it's tough to displace people. There's some really, really great places there. So I think part of what we're going to have to do is figure out how to use the material that we're creating here in our digital learning to do a better job of combining together many of our strengths. Obviously, undergraduate education, things like undergraduate research, access to entrepreneurship, access to university collaborations with industry, university collaborations with government, and so on and so forth. I think there's a lot of good opportunities to mine there. And our foray into MOOCs is giving us a good platform to explore and prototype these different ideas. And I'm looking forward to the discussions shortly with the New Education Technologies Committee where we can look at this in more detail. So let me tell you a few things I think are going to be Vanderbilt's benefit from the MOOC experience. One thing, of course, is to create lifelong learning groups that are specialized around particular topics where people can meet together virtually or physically here at Vanderbilt, in Nashville, in Middle Tennessee, in the southern region, and get smarter about things to help make us more competitive and more technologically advanced. Another thing that I've found, and certainly can speak to this, that the effort required putting together the MOOC material made my face-to-face classes way better than they've ever been before, for a lot of reasons. First of all, the material is now impeccably organized. I don't know how you guys were, but before, when I would get to class, I would bank on the fact that I could extemporaneously talk at length about many topics and make it sound exciting to mask the fact that I really didn't have organized slides or presentation material, because I could just get up and talk at length about something. I couldn't do that when I did the MOOC. So everything is completely organized with introductions, learning objectives, short segments, summary. Everything's put together in nice little packages. I call this the Olympic host city phenomena. When a city hosts the Olympics, they suddenly get better streets, they get better stadiums, they get better hotels, they get all kinds of things, better transportation. The course also becomes more consistent because the material has been really looked at carefully, and I can remember what I'm going to say now across different semesters, and I can also start to involve other people in teaching the course, and the material doesn't vary quite so wildly the way it would have otherwise. And something else that we get is students can go back and watch the videos at their own pace. They can come to class, we can do other things in class, we can flip the class, but they can still go back and get that knowledge at their pace when they need it, when they want it, like before the quiz. Now, there's a lot of discussion about MOOCs. There's this discussion about traditional classroom, where the teacher's role is the sage on the stage, and the new model in the flipped classroom is guide on the side. I personally think that's a very bad idea, because if you are the guide on the side, you're going to get yourself disintermediated in no time flat, because you can be replaced by some other guide on the side who doesn't really have much to offer above and beyond just sort of proctoring or being a recitation lead for the material that you're watching on videos. So a much better metaphor or model, I think, is the host with the most. As a teacher in a digital learning environment, you're basically kind of like Billy Crystal or someone at the Oscars. You're queuing up acts, you're giving material, you have to spend a lot of time preparing the material, you're responsible for putting on a great show, and so on and so forth. But you're not just sitting there passively pushing the play button on the projector and having people just watch the stuff and then asking any questions and seeing what they know. So I think we need to think about flipped classroom a little bit differently. I also think there's a tremendous opportunity to use digital learning to connect with alums who want to keep up to speed with material that they may have learned at Vanderbilt and then things have progressed since then, keep track of professors that were meaningful to them when they were there. So I think there's a great way for us to do alumni outreach, which can be tremendously powerful to Vanderbilt. We can also show the rest of the world, especially prospective freshmen, how great it is to come to Vanderbilt by having our material available online. There's even more things we could do where you could actually have people virtually join a semester as a high school student, find out what it's like to take a Vanderbilt course. We're starting to think through Doug Fisher and the people at Vital about ways to do MOOCs for high school students to help them know what Vanderbilt's like, try to attract the best and brightest. And I think there's also a good angle here for engagement with various corporate relation opportunities, showing the kinds of things we teach here at Vanderbilt that may be useful to corporations in terms of training, research, collaborations, and so on that we could also leverage as well. There's a bunch of other things you can take a look at this fact that'll give you more insight about benefits. So to go ahead and wrap up here, I think MOOCs are an example of what Friedman calls the triple convergence of technology, business processes, and global workforce. By the way, a little side note, the picture that's on this slide was originally on the back cover of his book, The World is Flat. And the title of the picture is, "See, I Told You So," because they obviously have sailed to the edge of the earth and are falling off the flat world. For various reasons, he had to take it off his book, but we can show it on our slides. I personally believe that it's usually better to surf the tsunami than to either get crushed by it or left behind. You got to find just the right place to be in order to stay on top of this. I think MOOCs and digital learning are going to have a tsunami-like effect in many parts of education, and so we want to make sure we're front and center there. I think this is going to happen fast. I think education is going to get transformed rather quickly, which is pretty amazing because it's been more or less the same for hundreds of years. And so either being a leader or a fast follower is essential here. We've got to make sure that we are part of the effort that's moving the world forward, not just sitting there going, I'm going to stick my head in the sand, I don't want to see this happening, this is terrible, the sky is falling. Along those lines, we're going to be teaching a new trans-institutional MOOC. Actually, it's a sequenced MOOCs course, or courses, that we're putting together in conjunction with University of Maryland. This was just announced a couple days ago. It's going to be the first trans-institutional MOOC, or MOOCs in the world, as far as we know. And the first part of the course will be taught by my colleague and collaborator for 25 years, Dr. Adam Porter at the University of Maryland, and he's going to be covering smartphone programming with Android, focusing primarily on the client side, the handheld side, user interface, user-facing perspective. And then that'll be the first 8 weeks, and then the next 8 to 10 weeks will be myself and Jules White doing the second course here at Vanderbilt, or from Vanderbilt. People can take it wherever they want to. We'll be focusing more on the server-side programming for Android. Jules will be talking about cloud computing, using cloud platforms like Jetty and so on. And so this will give us a chance to really put together a series of material that we previously could not have done before the advent of MOOCs, because there would have been no way for somebody to start a course in Maryland for the first semester and then transfer down here en masse to finish it up at Vanderbilt. So this paradigm gives us a chance to collaborate. Adam Porter and I have been looking for ways to collaborate for several decades. We've done a lot of research collaborations. This is the first time we can really get together and work together on education, which is really exciting. And we're also hoping to work with Jamie Pope and some of the nutrition work that she's doing by creating some apps that will be relevant for the kinds of things that she does. We just got a couple of things I want to tell you about. So we have some green screen equipment and lights that we got. I got that courtesy of ISIS. Jules got some nice video camera. We're going to get a teleprompter, courtesy of startup funds. And we just got permission to use one of the rooms up in Featheringill as a recording studio. So if anybody here is interested in taking a chance at learning more about this stuff, we're up to speed with things like Camtasia, ScreenFlow, Premiere, and so on. We have the video equipment up and running shortly, the green screen stuff. We're going to start producing our videos here shortly for next semester. But if you're interested in getting involved, if you'd like to learn about this, we'd be happy to help you and happy to help us learn more too, because I'm sure the people around here who have a lot more expertise than we do. There's also a paper that documents all of this stuff that you can take a look at my website, and it'll appear in the Splash 2013 conference in the Wavefront Forum. So as a wrap up, I wanted to say one more little thing, because it's on the back of my mind, and I just remembered it. So for many years, at places like Vanderbilt that are top-tier research and teaching universities, teaching has often been considered sort of a second-class citizen to research, especially in departments or schools where there's an opportunity to get research funding. This isn't true everywhere, of course, because not everybody has that opportunity. And it's interesting to kind of scratch your chin and wonder, why is that? Why has that been the case? And I think there's a couple of reasons, and I think that MOOCs and digital learning are going to change some of these dynamics. And this is a very good time to have these dynamics change, because there's some interesting forces at work with respect to federal budgets and sequestration that are relevant here. So why has research been emphasized? Well, number one, all things being equal, finding a person who's a great researcher who can go out there and write proposals and get funding and mentor students and get papers accepted at top places, that's a really hard thing to do. And I think, not to take anything away from great teachers, but I think there probably historically has been a bigger supply of great teachers than there's been a supply of great researchers. So that's one thing. Secondly, people who are great at research have historically gotten tremendous global visibility for their work. If you're a great scientist, if you're a great engineer, researcher, you publish in top conferences, top journals, you get invited to speak all around the world, you write books, you give talks, you do all kinds of things that they're outwardly facing, and so you help to give the university more visibility, which is really important. And I think there's also the dimension that great researchers bring in funding too, which is great to support grad students. Historically, teachers haven't had that advantage. If you were a great teacher, the people who knew you were a great teacher were almost exclusively the students who took your class, and every 6 years, maybe one of your colleagues would come sit in when it was time for tenure or promotion to see if you were a good instructor. But nobody else knew that you were great for the most part. It was very hard to get known beyond your classroom. Moreover, teaching historically has not been a huge money-making thing unless you're going to teach a classroom with 1,000 people, which is pretty hard to do. So I think that's why research has historically been emphasized. One of the things that's happening with MOOCs is all of a sudden you can teach a class that has way more of an impact in an audience than most of the kinds of papers we write as researchers. There's a joke we sometimes say in quiet times when no one's listening, that many papers written for journals are write-only papers. They were written and they were read by the reviewers, and they're very esoteric and nobody reads them. If you make a MOOC with 80,000 people, 400,000 people, that's a lot of people who get to find out what it is that you do and the expertise that you bring to your field. So all of a sudden, you have a way through education to have global impact that really was hard to do before. And secondly, if we can ever figure out how to correctly come up with the financing model for this, it ought to be possible for people who are very good educators to be able to turn that into something that brings in funding, much the same way that great researchers bring in funding. And the fact that we're undergoing a lot of tightening of the belt for sequestration reasons, and people are putting caps on NIH funding or DoD funding and so on for research, which has traditionally sustained the research enterprise, means that I think we need to be thinking a little bit more carefully about where we get the funding from. Okay, so with that, I'm a couple minutes over, but if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.